So, thank you everyone for coming. We are going to talk today about the overlap between security and, well, basically how Nuna as an organization is utilizing Chef as part of its security tech stack and why that makes sense, and we'll talk about some of our philosophies around all of that. Just for reference, my name is Robert Wood. This is Meg. We both work at, as I mentioned, a company called Nuna. We're a healthcare analytics company based out of the San Francisco area, and we're going to dive right in. So our talk is going to be split into two main sections. The first section covers these couple of areas, and basically we're going to talk about some of the bigger, broader problems around why Chef is relevant in our particular case. So it's not just, and just for context, we're using it on laptops, endpoints, not servers in AWS or some other cloud-based infrastructure. And so we're going to start by painting the picture around why this is important, why that matters, and then we're going to end kind of dovetail into exactly how we're using Chef and some of our workflows and our particular tooling tech stacks and such. And so the first thing that we need to do is clarify or start to explore what the newer types of businesses look like. So the enterprises without borders. So in the olden days, we used to be able to just build up big walls, make everything very, very restrictive in our environments. We could firewall the hell out of everything. And it was really easy to just tell employees, you come to work, you do your work, you leave your work there, and we're going to keep threats out, we're going to keep data in. And that was kind of how things worked. And now the script is kind of flipped, and we've got power and control more in the hands of employees and consumers, in the sense that any employee can likely walk into your place of business or in our place of business and just stand up put their credit card in some form, order some new cloud service, and away they are using some new unsanctioned service in the context of their day-to-day work. And they're probably also bringing some kind of personal device, whether it's their mobile phone, whether it's a laptop, this concept of BYOD, or bring their own devices to work, and they're doing things, whether it's just email or Slack, or whether it's bigger and broader than that. And so we went from something like this in the olden days, where we had our most valued assets tucked away behind many, many layers and walls of security. And in this new age, if we try to embrace and control things like we did here against threats that are more like this, that can easily hop over those borders, or that can transcend those walls, or where those walls don't really exist and they're more just figments of our imagination, then we're going to be in a really hard situation or a really hard spot as security teams or security practitioners trying to safeguard our assets as they're moving all over the place. And so in order to effectively protect things, we need to adapt and we need to evolve the way that we think about security in this world. And so given that a lot of organizations are, so I can actually see what in the world I'm talking about. So we have to move away from our previous assumptions. We have to get away from this concept where everything can be controlled and monitored, and we can respond to things in a really strict fashion. But to do that, we have to figure out where and what we can control and why. And in the spirit of why the Chef community is important and why a lot of these open source communities are important, we have to, as security teams, orient ourselves very much around the needs and benefits and working styles of the people we're trying to safeguard. Because if we don't do that, they're just going to end up being our biggest enemy, and they're going to circumvent everything that we're trying to do anyways. And so what we're doing has to be transparent and has to work with what their with their working style, with their process, et cetera.
So in that, like, bringing in like the users and the community and trying to figure out what needs to happen, we still need to take a security stance. So we need to look at what those things are that we need to control. Like, I call them here things. So what is the thing? What is the risk around that thing? And how much do we actually need to control it? Like, should we control it? Do we have to control it? Where's the compliance issues in like why we're controlling anything? And we do that control through different policies, changes, etc. We use a lot of Chef for some of this control, but like without that control, without having any of it, like now as Bob said, we don't have control over everything. And when you don't have that kind of control, we have to rethink on what we're focusing on. Where are the risks? What is the most important thing? So again, we need to balance that control with forcing those traditional boundaries. I know that even recently, in recent years, I've worked at companies where they're on this hard bent, everything needs to be controlled, and it actually caused things to be less secure. Because we do have these BYOD devices. People are going around these security controls if they feel like they don't make any sense. I mean, who in this room has done that kind of thing where you're like, why is this here? Why do we have to do this? Exactly, like there's a number of people. And so we do need to work with them.
Yeah. And so really what this kind of environment ended up, at least for us, we were creating this culture of employee-driven choice and freedom in devices and services being used and things like that. And so we had to, when we were beginning to build out our security program, and Meg was one of the early hires that we had to start to ask ourselves, like, what are we going to do? What kind of program do we want to make? And we don't think that we're alone, at least in the San Francisco area. We know we're not alone, but even bigger and broader than that, we don't think we're alone in asking ourselves this question of, when we're not in control of every little thing and where everything is at all times, what are we really going to do? And so this was one option for us. And if anyone doesn't remember the atrocious movie that was Spider-Man 3, we could have taken this approach and maybe salvaged things, but as that movie turned out, it would have been probably a train wreck. But instead, we ended up taking a look at, we ended up adapting. And we first started by recognizing that we couldn't exert our control over every little thing, such as where employees are at all times, where laptops are at all times, what services are being used, et cetera, et cetera. And if anyone has ever taken a stroll through RSA, the vendor floor, any of those other security conferences, you've probably seen a whole lot of fluff coming into this detection and response mode. So there's a million vendors popping up in the threat intelligence space. There's a million vendors popping up saying, control is dead, you're already breached, it's all over, go with us, and even though it's all over, spend money with us and we're going to make it all better for you. We're going to give you more insight, we're going to give you more abilities to respond to a breach. But the big problem there is, with this very dynamic, evolving environment that many organizations are these days, it's very, very hard to actually figure out, if we don't have control or we don't even attempt to get our arms around things, where do you start to layer and put your detection and response controls? You can just shotgun them everywhere, but unless you're Facebook or Netflix or Google and you have next to an unlimited security budget, that's going to be very, very inefficient. And even those very big programs take a control-focused approach. And so what we want to focus on here is that by starting with control and then moving your way out, you can actually, very similar to, if you think about the way that, let's say the president moves throughout, I think he's over in Rome right now, meeting with the Pope in the Vatican. The president is a very high-value asset, and he has to be controlled. He's moving all over the place. The Secret Service has to find ways to control the environment in which he's in, and then they work their way out. They will control what's most close to him, who's closest to him, who's able to come into a venue and see him, shake hands with him, et cetera, and their detection and response abilities work their way out. They use control to make detection and response more efficient and more effective. And so to start this, we actually have to take a step back and understand, once we kind of embrace those concepts that we can't get our arms around everything, we don't have unlimited money, especially as a newer company, and I'm sure many other companies operating in the real world, that is a real constraint, and so we have to do things intelligently. And so in order to figure out how to be intelligent, we have to first figure out what our threat model looks like and what our attack surface is. So there's many moving parts of an attack surface. They all fit together in some form or fashion, and we'll walk through that next. But as I mentioned with the president analogy, you could think about these things as concentric rings around what is most important. And then they, of course, just move their way out. So this graph, or this very simple diagram, is an outline of Nuna's attack surface. So we fall into this category of what some call cloud native. So we don't actually own, well, the only hardware we own are our laptops, really, and some routers and stuff at the office. And our office is basically like a glorified Starbucks. We have free coffee, we have snacks, and then we have laptops running around connecting to the internet and doing work. And so this boundary over here are the physical things that we actually have some element of control over. So we do fully manage our office network. You see that's tucked away in there. We lease our physical office space, and so we have some control there, but not a lot. Our endpoints, we do own them. We do give them to employees. We do provision them, as we'll talk about later on in this talk with Chef and a myriad of other security agents. But they do leave the office. Employees take them home. They take them to the coffee shops. They take them on vacation, et cetera. I've taken mine to the conference here. They leave our control. They leave our office boundary here of the things that we really have our hands around. And then our users, of course, are, we've all read, a myriad of stories where users are going to do what users do. We can't ever control what people are, how people are going to react to a policy, how people are going to, they're not scripts, unfortunately. So they are going to do what they're going to do. And then our product infrastructure is all a series of either SaaS apps or AWS or Google Cloud Platform, and we build all of our product infrastructure in managed cloud environments. And so while we have some form of control, it's not, the shared responsibility model differs between those different cloud deployment models. And all we can really do is configure things and layer things and put things together using the building blocks that they provide us. We can't really dig in and say, here is how we want your physical data center to be. We have to trust that they are doing a certain amount of things right. We have to trust their audit and governance functions, things like that. And so if we think about our attack surface, we've got a few areas for, we've broken things down into things that don't really matter to us, things that do matter to us, but they're like a layer of separation removed, and then things that really, really matter to us. And for us working in the healthcare space, that is things like that are controlling PHI, controlling health data, of course. And so those really, really hot button topics are the users and the product infrastructure, those blurbs colored in red. The things that are one step removed that interface with those really hot, high risk areas are the endpoints and the SaaS apps, as you can see. And then the things that are more, like it doesn't really matter if something happens there. The ultimate risk to the business is very, very small if you quantify it in dollar values. And so we're not going to put a lot of detection and control and response mechanisms there because it's just not a very good return on investment. And so the rest of our talk is really going to focus on how we married users and endpoints and really started to build concentric rings of controls and like security controls in this distributed world that we're operating in. And so we wanted to provide this diagram here as a mechanism for anybody else who wants to or who is struggling with this kind of program rollout and where to divvy up their efforts, because any vendor is going to walk in and tell you that they've got the silver bullet for all your problems if you're in a position where you're fielding requests or outreach from them. And if you really sit down and think about where a particular vendor solution fits in this bigger picture, oftentimes they will solve a very specific problem maybe on an endpoint or in a physical environment or a SaaS app, something like that. And if you just look at the big picture of attack surface, if they're promising you a silver bullet in something that doesn't really matter, you have to really ask yourself, is that thing worth spending all that money on?
So now we jump over to the endpoint and user side of things. So we're going to focus on those two little blurbs that were in the yellow. And first, I'm going to cover kind of how we bring in those ideas from the security and risk assessment side of things into this side. So the main thing that we need to do and that we have done is, again, we can't discount what the user's needs and desires are, and that they expect this freedom. And it's increasingly becoming so. We can bring BYOD devices to work. We can do all of these things. We can carry our laptops around with us. We're not chained to a desk. And we need to tie all of the choices that we're making in this section back to those concepts and back to security and compliance, because those are very important. We can't forget about them. But we also can't force those old boundaries.
So the first thing that we want to cover in this particular section is a little bit more about our particular tech stack. So regarding the distributed endpoints that are running all over the place, they are largely composed of macOS. I cannot read a thing when I walk out, sorry. Given that we are using Chef, it's probably self-evident that we do try to really embrace the idea of applying configuration to those endpoints, of course. And one of the big things that led us to Chef is, of course, that we can codify that configuration. We also needed to make sure that we, as was specified in the threat model, or you can see in the threat model, we don't have, our endpoints are not necessarily married to the Office network. So an endpoint can operate in a space and time. I don't really know what's happening there. I'll try to talk loudly. An endpoint can operate in a space and time that is separate or decoupled from the Office network. And so we needed to take traditional security controls and turn them into agents that go with the user wherever they're going to go. And then, as you also saw on the attack surface, we try to keep our product infrastructure very much separate from the users and the endpoints. And so that way there's a few layers of separation in the form of VPNs, certificate checks, two-factor authentication, things like that. And so you have to work your way through, regardless of where you are. We don't necessarily grant any particular element of trust or permission or roles based on where that person is, whether they're in the office or working from a coffee shop. And the things that are really driving us in this way, or just to set a little bit more context, of course, we do have our regulatory requirements here. Since we are dealing with healthcare data, we've got to worry about things like HIPAA, high trust, our customers. We work with a lot of enterprises, so they're demanding things like NIST 853, the ARS, the ISO 27000. And so we have a lot of regulatory and governance requirements that we have to operate under. And a lot of those things, if you've ever read through those very arduous, painful documents, a lot of them will specify that endpoints, that you have certain security controls in place. And so we had to basically boil those security controls into something that just went with the user. And I think we've covered all this other stuff here. And so this is just a little snapshot into some of the tooling that we do use. You'll see Chef bolded there because we're using Chef to instrument and configure and deploy and manage all of these things once it hits the endpoint and it's running and it's operating. So.
Okay. So moving on for that how, what is our Chef workflow? I know that many people who use Chef are using it for server management, or virtual machines. We're applying those same techniques as everyone else is. We're just doing it on endpoints with security in mind, and with the knowledge that our endpoints are not going to all be the same. We want to provide a nice, good baseline for them, but people need to be able to install things on their machines. They need to be able to customize their machines, especially engineers. And it ends up, like they're all different, they're all special, they're all unique, and we need to make it so that that's okay.
Yeah, and just a like slight caveat there, or like other point to add on, those other snowflake style changes that end up getting made, we wanted them to be governed by and enforced by the baseline changes that we end up applying. So, for instance, if somebody's applying or installing some rando app, or they're doing some random browsing, we want that browsing or that application installation to be controlled through and checked by like antivirus programs or DNS filtering, things like that. And so we don't want them to be able to do anything but do things within the constraints that we're giving them through this configuration and agent-based baseline.
Exactly. So our workflow looks pretty simple. Our node's life cycle is that we bootstrap the node before we give it to the user. It checks in with the Chef server 4 times an hour, and so every 15 minutes it's double checking to make sure, have we sent anything new out, and has anything changed? Have they changed a configuration that we want changed back? When we reclaim the laptop from the user, we remove it from Chef and we wipe and we re-image. Throughout this whole process, though, we keep in mind our security requirements because, again, we're both in security, and we're working with endpoint management as well on all of this. We want to make sure that we can trace nodes back to a specific user, to an asset tag in our inventory system. We want alerts for nodes that aren't checking in, and we have these set up. And we also want to have alerts and checks that compare AD users and Chef nodes, and all of this is built around these compliance ideas. We want to make sure that everything is kosher in our environment. So moving on, so how do we actually cook up that security? Like we've talked about some of like the higher level concepts, but what are we actually doing? What kind of cookbooks are we running? And so what we're using Chef for is for deploying security agents to the endpoints. We're using it for applying hardening configurations. You can find lists of hardening configurations on the internet. And so instead of taking those and having to manually do them, we have a cookbook that we created, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that automatically applies a number of these really basic hardening configurations for us. We also use it to deploy a forwarder to these nodes so that we can grab logs. A lot of the security agents that we use require logs. And we also use it for IT provisioning. Let's install viscosity. Let's install this or that or the other thing, and all of these security agents as well.
Yeah, and so not only like the initial node bootstrapping and setup, but once something is out deployed to the fleet, IT will oftentimes need to like help troubleshoot something, to push out some new version of an application. Standard IT functions. Chef enables us to not only be very audit friendly with our codified configuration and security agent distribution, but also give them the capabilities that they need to manage and report on and have visibility into endpoints when they're running around out in the world. And those quick, every couple of minute check-ins help them, make sure that users don't have some big lag time between when they have an issue and when they can get support.
Exactly. And like if we send out a cookbook, everyone can get it within a very short amount of time, or a change to something. So I'm gonna go in next into why we're using Chef, some of the issues that we've had that have come up with doing this, because this is kind of a non-conventional thing, at least it feels like within the community. Trying to make it more conventional, but currently there's some issues. And then going to go into the cookbooks, a few of the cookbooks and groups that we're a part of. So why Chef? One of the biggest reasons is multi-OS support. We are mainly a Mac shop right now, but if we need to move on to Windows, if we need to move on to Linux, if we need to move on to anything else and allow that flexibility, we need to have something that can do that. So a lot of these Mac endpoint management, configuration management tools are Mac only. And so we needed something different. It's also extremely extensible. Changes are audit friendly. This is a big one. We can point to in code, say, okay, like we are subject to like these compliance regulations for like HIPAA and everything else. We can point to in code, look, this is where we're setting that. This is where we're doing that. And that's extremely important. So it's super audit friendly. And then, and one other thing is the chef agent to server security. We're very happy with that. But one of the other big things is that this is a stellar community. Everyone is here to support everyone else. And if someone is using, Chef in this new way, people get excited about it and people get involved. And that's an awesome thing about Chef.
Yeah, and one other really quick thing to note about the audit-friendly aspect of it. So because we have everything codified in terms of what agents are deployed, what configurations are applied, things like that, when we're going through some of our customers' vendor governance processes, or we're going through audits, so we just went through a couple of stages for HIPAA assessment and a SOC 2 Type 2 audit with a third-party validated firm. What we can do is basically take the cookbook and just send that along to whoever is auditing us and just say, here, audit this, we'll answer your questions, but here, instead of say, answer their questions, schedule time, or grant them access to like a Casper web portal or something like that, because I don't know about you guys, but we were not really comfortable with having some externally validated party have access to something that could control our entire fleet, or they potentially break something, or just all sorts of things could go wrong in that situation. So we can just give them access to the cookbook, or just point them to the URL, since our hardened OS one is open source, and just say, have fun with it.
Yep, go look at it. So some of those considerations and the things that we've had difficulties with. It seems like there is quite a bit less macOS support in the community, at least currently. Supermarket cookbooks are often geared toward Windows or different Linux distros. And there's a few small issues in Core Chef that we're working through that we're trying to get fixed. And some of these cause these other issues. Like, we need to create more cookbooks ourselves. We can't just pull them out of supermarket because a lot of them aren't there. And we're trying to contribute some of those back slowly. And then we also need to reinvent current cookbooks that are already there. Again, if it's there and we fix it and we want to push it back out, we're still having to reinvent it. But again, all of it's getting better. Like, my first chef event was Chef Summit, and things have gotten extremely, so much better even since then, and that wasn't that long ago. So how do we write our cookbooks? Our cookbooks are written for enforcement. We are not saying, oh, here's your laptop. It has these security configurations. Change whatever ones you want. Again, it changes them back. So we need to be able to enforce these things in order to go with compliance.
Stay compliant.
Yeah, stay compliant. So our main goal with our cookbooks is to create this nice base where you can build off of that. But the base is a secure base, and it has all of our security agents and everything else, and those things will always be there. They're also written to be dynamic. They're written to account for these different needs of users. Again, we just do the base. You can build on that. It's okay. It's okay for users to be able to do things on their machines. And we also write them with the future in mind. We want to make them so that we can reuse them in the future, that it's easy to update, it's easy to maintain. So one of these, which is Nuna's first open source project, actually, not just Nuna's first open source cookbook, we released a couple of months ago, trying to get it rolling. It is now available in the supermarket as of today. Yay!
Thank you.
So that is out. That is some of these baseline security configurations. It doesn't have everything, and we'd love people to get involved. If you think that if you're concerned about X, Y, or Z thing, and you don't see it in there, let us know or contribute it back yourself. Like, we have a lot of changes and we have a lot of things we want to do with this, but it's a good baseline. It's a good place to start. So basically what it does is we take some of those ideas that are out in the security community about what it means to have a secure laptop, what it means to have a secure macOS system. We've taken them, we've put them into the cookbook, we've made it pretty simple. We have them all in there, like we have separate libraries to help distribute some of these things so you can actually find them. And then we put it onto our laptops in order to have the security and have this compliance.
Yeah. And one really useful thing for us has been, and like an improvement we want to end up making, is that credit goes to Meg on that one. She has a far cuter eye than I do. But one thing that we want to end up doing is making some improvements for loaner laptops that we're issuing. So we have certain requirements that we're subject to per the ARS and some customer contracts, that if we have somebody traveling internationally and taking a loaner laptop with them to do any kind of work, or they're going there for extended periods of time, we need to be able to apply an additional set of controls that are a little bit more restrictive and sandbox-like to them. And we also want to stub out and make sure that all, very similar to what you would find in like the CAIQ or any kind of global compliance controls matrix, we want to stub out and say all of the changes that are made, here are the particular controls that are being met, referenced by guideline, things like that. And so an auditor can just go through and they don't necessarily have to understand Chef or your customers, whoever, but instead they could just read through the comments and see that these 10 controls that I'm actually looking for per these regulatory standards are met, and voila, I can move on and go to the next thing.
Exactly. And one of the other things I wanted to point out was the Sous Chefs group. So if y'all don't know, Sous Chefs is a group within the chef community. You can find us on the community Slack. And there's a lot of these cookbooks that maybe are out there for macOS, but haven't been maintained in a long time. And Sous Chefs takes over a lot of these not maintained cookbooks, not just macOS, but takes over a lot of these, finds maintainers and gets them up to speed so that we can continue using them and the community can benefit from them. One of these example cookbooks is the macOS X cookbook, which a lot of people in the community rely upon for editing plist files. Which is how you do most of the configurations in Mac currently. So taking that over, trying to get some work in on that, and there's a bunch of other cookbooks out there that we also want to get work done on. So if anyone wants to give back to the community, come in and help, and maybe one day if you're not managing your Macs with Chef, you can be. Let's make the community better and help everyone be secure.
And it's way cheaper than like a Casper.
It is way cheaper.
Has ever done price
Technically, you
comparisons.
could just use it on your home, like a bunch of the stuff on your own laptop. Chef Zero it, like now suddenly your laptop is secure.
Indeed. All right, and so that is the end of our content here. And so we want to first say thank you, and hope folks learned something. And if anyone has any questions, we will be hanging around, or we can take them now. So. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, can we get the microphone so that...
Oh, I can repeat too.
Oh, okay, yeah. You can repeat. I don't know where the microphone is though. Oh, there it is.
So ironically enough, I'm actually thinking of this kind of application for managing my wife's laptop and my own. And as a lawyer, of course, she's very concerned about security. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious to know if you can give us some more details on what kinds of endpoint protection software you're using, what type of antivirus software you're using. Are you using something like Little Snitch for network monitoring, or BlockBlock for file access monitoring, et cetera?
Sure. So right now, the agents that we're deploying are a little bit more like enterprise-centric, as you might imagine. We had it referenced somewhere in there, but for antivirus, we're using Cylance currently. file integrity monitoring, we're using Open OS Query, which you could, of course, also use as it is an open source project. Network monitoring, we're not currently doing any like host-based network monitoring, but instead relying on like DNS filtering and other more browser-centric. Like we have a DLP solution in place, and a lot of our controls are like a lot of our more network-centric controls are deployed and managed over in the product infrastructure space. But like I've seen people deploy Bro, for instance, as a like on a particular host and use that for network monitoring. And there's a few other things you could do just for managing a single laptop. But I imagine you could pretty easily extend or use this to just install something like Clam or whatever other AV solutions on there.
And I mean, as far as hardening configurations, we're doing things like turning off file sharing, turning off printer sharing, all these basic things that are vectors for a lot of these risks that most people don't use. Those are the things we're turning off. We're making it so that your screen locks. We're making it so that,
I looked at some of the scripts, and it looks like you're also turning off Bluetooth and Wi-Fi.
Yeah, we're only turning off Bluetooth if people do not have Bluetooth paired. If you have a Bluetooth device paired, it does not turn off Bluetooth. But if you don't and you're not using one, it just turns it off. It doesn't kill it.
Yeah, it doesn't remove the ability for you to do it. It's just
exactly. Because why keep it open if you're not using a Bluetooth device?
So out of curiosity, why Cylance as opposed to something like, say, Bitdefender, which is a bit more cross-vendor, cross-platform?
So that decision was made a while ago. We're actually in the process of reevaluating whether or not we want to stick with Cylance. So if anyone else wants to shout out some really solid, we have some.
There are a few others that get high ratings as well, but
totally.
Bitdefender seems to be one of the best ones that seems to be multi-platform.
Yep, yeah, we've looked at, so that is on our short list. We looked at Sentinel-1 is on our short list. Bit9 Carbon Black Stack is on our short list. Yeah, like Mac security stuff in general is just very much lacking, and Cylance is
and very different from everything else.
Oh yeah,
very different than anything else. Yeah, and of course, like anytime Mac goes through and makes a major update to their OS, like they're changing a lot of APIs, and so
everything breaks.
It took Cylance 7 months to update for 10.12 after 10.12 was released.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think Mac PGP has still been updated yet for Sierra.
Yeah. Yeah. So cool. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah. We can repeat.
Yeah, we can repeat.
So you mentioned that there were some issues with Core Chef. Can you elaborate on what those issues were?
So you asked what the issues with Core Chef are that we've noticed. So 2 of the things that I've noticed, and I could be wrong, maybe it's fixed now, but as of a couple months ago, file and directory resources, if you're trying to edit like user local, it looks down at user and says, that's protected. User local isn't. And so it won't let you use those resources in those directories that you can edit that are contained in directories you can't. So those are some of the issues that we've seen as far as some of those Core Chef issues.
They were pretty few and far between, though.
Yeah.
It was
and we
more
just get
like
around it with like execute resources instead.
Yeah, it was more like these little weird esoteric bugs that we had to like spend way too much time digging to get through.
Yeah.
How do you test your changes?
So how do we test our changes? We are using Test Kitchen. We have a 10.12 box that we've created using Bento and Tim Sutton's scripts. So basically you have to use Tim Sutton's stuff for the first part. Don't use Tim Sutton's JSON for Packer, like the second part. You just take what you've prepped and put it into Bento. And back in November, I contributed the 10.12 JSON for Bento. So that's there, it works. And I was chatting with the sous chefs people, and we're hoping to get up some instructions for people that actually says, this is when you switch, this is what you do, and these are the things you might need to put into Test Kitchen.
Do you have in-spec compliance profiles that you use, or do you just do the hardening?
We just do the hardening, but actually yesterday we started getting really interested in in-spec. Some of our concerns in the past had been macOS support, and so like we're hoping that maybe that's sort of worked through by now, but we don't know.
Okay, certainly would would want to work with you on
Okay.
that. And
Yeah, that'd be
also,
great.
I believe CIS has benchmarks for macOS. I don't know if they're updated for 10.12.
Okay. I
They
think they
usually
are
like-
recently.
We
Okay.
did pull
It
the
was
CIS was one of the
Yeah.
things that we pulled. We pulled those. The NSA had an older STIGs thing that was released, but some of the stuff goes away, some of it is still relevant. And then we pulled from a bunch of like customer requirements and stuff that get very specific about types of tooling or other like specific screen lockout or password complexity requirements, things like that. So,
Exactly.
and those are of course all configurable.
Yep.
Yeah. What's up?
So you mentioned that you have one cookbook that's released to the public right now. Are you guys having plans to release multiple cookbooks to the public, as well as what are some of the other chef tools are you using to display this, or test kitchen, chef server? Are you guys using any other solutions such as Chef Automate or anything within the chef ecosystem?
So you're asking if we are planning on releasing any more cookbooks into open source that we have other than the one, and then what else within the chef tool set are we using?
Yes.
So for the first question, we have a few things that we're hoping to contribute, but nothing that's actively there. We want to see what the community needs and put time into those things. So that's where we're at on that. And then for the second question, we're using Test Kitchen, and we use Hosted Chef. We don't use Automate. We don't use Inspect yet. We don't use a lot of these other tools. We're just baseline, chef hosted. Yep.
Yeah, and one of the things that that led us away from Chef Automate originally is we wanted to keep as few as possible deployment models in place, even though endpoints are somewhat of a unique beast within our particular environment, and I'm sure within yours. We didn't, like a lot of our deployments right now are driven through code is hosted in GitLab, CI happens in Jenkins, and deployment happens after that. And so we wanted to see if we can basically rely on the same kind of pipeline and tool set and not introduce something else that is completely separate, that requires more like a completely different mental model, completely different set of skills to maintain, and basically like increase our bust factor around who knows how to deal with that thing over there. And we want more people to be able to rally to any kind of breakage or outage or improvements, things like that. So.
Yeah, and that's also why we moved to Chef Hosted, because we used to have a Chef server, and we weren't able to get it working like the rest of our deployment models. So it was like, this is not worth like having a completely different deployment for this one thing.
Yeah.
And
it was
so
a
we had
headache
to
in a lot of
just
respects.
go with Chef Hosted, and we're quite happy with that decision.
Yeah.
As far as your remote users, do you mandate them to bring up a VPN tunnel so that they can get off to the rest of your infrastructure when they're like coffee shops and things like that? Or how do you manage your remote road?
So the question was, how do we manage our, the people who are operating in a remote capacity, working remotely? So in terms of them accessing product infrastructure, even if they're working in the office, they still have to go through VPNs and certificate checks and all of that to get into anything sensitive. Most of the stuff that runs our corporate operations are, they're internet facing and web accessible anyways. They're just behind a SAML SAML portal. So we use Okta for that. You go in, log in, and then based on your role, you're given access to a set of resources. With regards to the actual provisioning and such, so we don't provision people remotely. We provision them locally at our office, then they get their laptop. So for instance, if a laptop gets hosed or they're getting their initial setup, like they come to us for their like first week or onboarding, things like that. And then administration past that is just it happens through cookbook updates, and then when their laptop checks in, it would get the latest update, apply it locally, and they're off to the races. So that's how we handle it. But I'm sure there's some other nifty ways we could do it in the future.
So I think we're actually over time. I know.
Are we
Ask
gonna?
us afterwards.
Oh, all right.
That's
Yeah.
true. So yeah, if people want to go, don't feel bad about getting up, but you can totally ask your question.
Sorry.
Like, I don't want people to feel bad.
I wanted to say that for all of you who weren't at the summit, she is solely responsible for making everything regarding OS X awesome at Summit, and I'm so glad that you stuck with it. We had a ton of fun at the Summit, and it's great to see that the momentum's coming up. So thank you to you personally for everything that you have done for this.
Thank you.